Margaret wiped the sweat from her forehead as she hung the last of the laundry on the line behind her small farmhouse. The Texas sun beat down mercilessly, and the cotton dress she wore clung to her skin in the oppressive heat. It had been 3 months since her husband Thomas died in that terrible accident with the horses, and every day felt like a struggle to keep their small farm running. She looked across the vast expanse of land that stretched beyond her property line, where the Blackwood Ranch dominated the horizon. James Blackwood owned nearly half the county, his cattle empire spanning thousands of acres. His ranch hands could be seen in the distance, moving like tiny figures across the endless grassland. Margaret had always admired the efficiency of his operation, though she'd never spoken more than a few polite words to the man himself. Thomas used to say that James Blackwood was a fair neighbor, never causing trouble over boundary lines or water rights like some of the other big ranchers in the area. But Thomas had also warned her to be careful around powerful men like Blackwood. They take what they want, he'd said, and they don't much care who gets hurt in the process. Now, as Margaret struggled to manage her small herd of cattle and patch of farmland alone, she wondered how long she could hold on to the property. The bank had already sent 2 letters asking about the mortgage payments, and her savings were dwindling fast. She had no family to turn to, no children to help with the work, and the neighboring farmers were too busy with their own struggles to offer much assistance. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made her look up from folding the dry clothes. A lone rider was coming down the dusty road toward her house, his figure silhouetted against the afternoon sun. As he drew closer, Margaret recognized the expensive black horse and the tall, broad-shouldered man in the saddle. James Blackwood himself was paying her a visit. She smoothed her dress and walked toward the front porch, her heart beating faster than usual. Blackwood was known throughout the county as a man who commanded respect. He was in his early 40s with graying temples and piercing blue eyes that seemed to see everything. His wife had died years ago from consumption, and he'd never remarried, dedicating himself entirely to building his cattle empire. "Mrs. Henderson," Blackwood called out as he dismounted near her front gate. His voice was deep and carried the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "I hope you don't mind me stopping by unannounced." Margaret nodded politely, though her hands trembled slightly as she clasped them in front of her. "Of course not, Mr. Blackwood. Would you like some water? It's terribly hot today." He tied his horse to the fence post and walked toward her with measured steps. Everything about James Blackwood spoke of control and power, from his perfectly maintained leather boots to the crisp white shirt that somehow remained spotless despite the dust and heat. "That's very kind of you," he said, removing his hat to reveal thick brown hair streaked with silver. Margaret hurried inside to fetch a glass of cool water from the well. When she returned, she found Blackwood standing on her porch, his keen eyes surveying her property with the calculating gaze of a businessman. She could see him taking note of the broken fence posts she couldn't afford to replace, the small barn that needed new shingles, and the modest herd of cattle grazing in her back pasture. "I was sorry to hear about Thomas," Blackwood said as he accepted the glass of water. "He was a good man, honest in his dealings. The community lost someone valuable when he passed." "Thank you," Margaret replied quietly. "He spoke well of you, too. Said you were always fair with the smaller ranchers around here." Blackwood drank the water slowly, his eyes never leaving her face. There was something intense about his gaze that made Margaret feel exposed, as if he could see through her polite exterior to the desperation and loneliness she tried so hard to hide. "Running a place like this alone can't be easy," he observed. "Have you given any thought to what you might do long-term?" The question hung in the air between them like a challenge. Margaret knew what he was really asking. Everyone in the county expected her to sell the farm and move to town, maybe find work as a seamstress or take in laundry to survive. The idea of a woman managing a cattle operation alone was almost unthinkable in their community. "I'm managing for now," she said carefully, though they both knew it wasn't entirely true. "Thomas left me with good land and healthy livestock. I'm hopeful I can make it work." Blackwood set the empty glass down on the porch railing and stepped closer to her. Margaret caught the scent of leather and tobacco that clung to his clothes, mixed with something else, a masculine presence that was both intimidating and strangely appealing. "Mrs. Henderson, I admire your determination, but I'm a practical man. If you ever find yourself in a situation where you need assistance, I want you to know that I'm willing to help." There was something in his tone that suggested his offer went beyond simple neighborly kindness. Margaret felt her cheeks flush, though she couldn't tell if it was from embarrassment or something else entirely. "That's very generous, Mr. Blackwood, but I couldn't accept charity." "I'm not talking about charity," he said, his voice dropping to a more intimate level. "I'm talking about a mutually beneficial arrangement. You have something I want, and I have resources you need. Sometimes the best solutions are the ones that serve everyone's interests." Margaret's pulse quickened as she tried to interpret his meaning. Was he talking about buying her land, or was there something more personal in his suggestion? The way he looked at her with those penetrating blue eyes made her feel things she hadn't experienced since Thomas's death. Things she shouldn't be feeling about her neighbor, especially not a man with James Blackwood's reputation and power. "I should let you get back to your work," Blackwood said, placing his hat back on his head. "But I meant what I said, Mrs. Henderson. Think about my offer. In this part of Texas, having the right kind of protection and support can mean the difference between thriving and barely surviving." As he mounted his horse and rode away, Margaret stood on her porch watching until he disappeared over the ridge. The encounter had lasted less than 20 minutes, but it had left her feeling unsettled and confused. James Blackwood's visit felt like the beginning of something, though she couldn't say what. All she knew was that her quiet, solitary life as a struggling widow was about to become much more complicated. 2 weeks passed before Margaret saw James Blackwood again, but his presence lingered in her thoughts like smoke from a distant fire. She found herself glancing toward the ridge where his vast ranch stretched beyond her sight, wondering if he might ride down that dusty road again. The practical part of her mind insisted she should forget about his mysterious offer and focus on her daily struggles, but something deeper stirred whenever she remembered the intensity in his blue eyes. The reality of her situation became clearer each morning when she checked on her small herd of cattle. 3 more calves had fallen sick with fever, and she lacked the money to bring the veterinarian out from town. Her vegetable garden was withering despite her best efforts to haul water from the well, and the roof of her barn had developed another leak during the last storm. Every problem seemed to multiply into 2 more, creating an endless cycle of worry and exhaustion. Margaret was mending a hole in her chicken coop when she heard the familiar sound of hoofbeats approaching. This time, however, it wasn't just one rider. James Blackwood was accompanied by 2 of his ranch hands, and they were driving a small group of cattle toward her property. She wiped her hands on her apron and walked out to meet them, curiosity overriding her nervousness. "Good morning, Mrs. Henderson," Blackwood called out as he dismounted. He looked even more commanding than she remembered, his presence somehow larger than life against the backdrop of the open prairie. "I hope you don't mind the intrusion, but I have a proposition for you." Margaret glanced at the cattle his men were herding into her pasture. They were prime beef stock, far superior to her own modest herd. "Mr. Blackwood, I'm not sure I understand what's happening here." He gestured toward the animals with a slight smile. "These cattle need grazing land for the next few months. My own pastures are getting overcrowded, and I thought perhaps we could arrange a deal. You let me graze them on your land, and I'll pay you a fair fee for the use of your grass and water." The offer was exactly what Margaret needed to hear. The money from grazing fees could help her catch up on her mortgage payments and maybe even hire some help with the farm work. But she'd learned enough from Thomas to be suspicious of deals that seemed too good to be true, especially when they came from powerful men like James Blackwood. "That's very generous," she said carefully. "But I have to ask why you're not using one of the other ranchers in the area. Surely there are bigger properties that could better accommodate your overflow." Blackwood stepped closer, his ranch hands maintaining a respectful distance as they continued to guide the cattle into her pasture. "The truth is, Mrs. Henderson, I prefer to do business with people I trust. Your late husband had a reputation for honesty and fair dealing. I'm hoping those qualities run in the family." There was something in his tone that suggested layers of meaning beneath his words. Margaret felt the same flutter of nervousness and excitement she'd experienced during his first visit. The way he looked at her made her acutely aware of her appearance. The simple blue dress she wore, the way the afternoon sun caught the auburn highlights in her brown hair, the fact that she was a woman alone discussing business with one of the most influential men in the county. "How long would this arrangement last?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady and businesslike. "Initially, I was thinking 3 months, Blackwood replied. "Of course, if it works out well for both of us, we might consider extending it. I believe in building long-term relationships with my business partners." The word partners seemed to hang in the air between them, loaded with possibilities that went far beyond cattle grazing. Margaret found herself studying his face, trying to read the intentions behind his carefully composed expression. James Blackwood was undeniably attractive, with the kind of rugged confidence that came from years of commanding respect and getting what he wanted. She couldn't help but wonder what it would be like to have that kind of strength and determination on her side. The payment would be monthly, she asked, forcing herself to focus on the practical details. Weekly, Blackwood said, pulling a leather wallet from his vest pocket. I believe in keeping my obligations current. He counted out several bills and handed them to her. This is for the first week. You'll find I'm quite reliable in my business dealings. Margaret accepted the money with trembling fingers. It was more than she'd made in the past month from selling her own cattle. The immediate relief of having cash in her hands was almost overwhelming, but it also made her realize just how desperate her situation had become. There is one other matter we should discuss, Blackwood continued, his voice dropping to a more intimate tone. This arrangement will require me to visit your property regularly to check on the cattle and ensure they're getting proper care. I hope you won't mind the frequent company. The suggestion sent a shiver through Margaret that had nothing to do with the evening breeze. She understood that James Blackwood's visits would involve much more than checking on livestock. There was an undercurrent of attraction between them that neither was openly acknowledging, but both clearly felt. The question was whether she was prepared to explore where that attraction might lead. I appreciate your business, Mr. Blackwood, she said formally, though her heart was racing. I'll make sure your cattle are well cared for. I'm certain you will, he replied, remounting his horse. I'll be back tomorrow evening to see how they're settling in. Perhaps you could have some coffee ready. These business discussions can be quite lengthy. As Blackwood and his men rode away, Margaret stood in her yard clutching the money he'd given her. She knew she'd just entered into more than a simple business arrangement. Whatever James Blackwood's true intentions, she was now connected to him in a way that would change her life irrevocably. The practical part of her mind warned that she was playing with fire, getting involved with a man whose power and influence could destroy her reputation if things went wrong. But as she watched the sun set over the prairie, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and red, Margaret realized she was tired of being practical. She was tired of struggling alone, tired of being afraid, and tired of the endless loneliness that had consumed her life since Thomas's death. If James Blackwood was offering her a way out of her isolation and financial troubles, maybe it was time to take the risk and see where it led. The cattle settled quietly into their new pasture as darkness fell over the farm. Margaret went inside to prepare for tomorrow's visit, her mind spinning with anticipation and anxiety about what the future might hold. The weeks that followed James Blackwood's cattle arrangement brought a rhythm to Margaret's life that she hadn't experienced since before Thomas's death. True to his word, Blackwood visited her property regularly, always with the stated purpose of checking on his livestock. But these visits inevitably extended far beyond simple ranch business, growing into long conversations, over coffee on her front porch as the sun set, over the Texas prairie. Margaret found herself looking forward to these evenings with an intensity that both thrilled and frightened her. Blackwood was an engaging conversationalist, sharing stories about his travels to cattle markets in Kansas City and Denver, his opinions on the changing economics of ranching, and his vision for the future of their county. He treated her as an equal in their discussions, asking for her thoughts and listening carefully to her responses in a way that made her feel valued and intelligent. During one particularly warm evening in late summer, their conversation took a more personal turn. Margaret had prepared fresh bread and jam to go with their coffee, and Blackwood complimented her cooking with such genuine appreciation that she felt a flush of pride. The simple pleasure of having someone notice and value her domestic skills reminded her how much she'd missed the companionship of marriage. You must have been quite lonely since Thomas passed, Blackwood observed, his blue eyes studying her face in the golden light of the setting sun. It takes courage to maintain a place like this without help. Margaret felt her defenses lowering under his sympathetic gaze. Some days are harder than others, she admitted. Thomas and I had planned to start a family, but she let the sentence trail off, unwilling to voice the disappointment and grief that still lingered around the edges of her heart. Children would have been a blessing, Blackwood agreed quietly. I often wonder what my life might have been like if Sarah and I had been fortunate enough to have a family before she passed. It was the first time he'd mentioned his late wife in such personal terms, and Margaret felt a surge of connection to him. They were both survivors of loss, both struggling to build meaning from the wreckage of their original dreams. The shared understanding created an intimacy between them that felt natural and right, despite the unconventional nature of their relationship. As September arrived, their evening visits began to extend later into the night. Blackwood would help Margaret with small repairs around the farm, using his obvious skill with tools to fix things she couldn't manage alone. She, in turn, would prepare increasingly elaborate meals, taking pleasure in cooking for someone who appreciated her efforts. The boundaries between business, arrangement, and personal relationship blurred until they became meaningless. The turning point came during a violent thunderstorm that struck the county without warning one evening while Blackwood was visiting. The rain came down in torrents, making travel dangerous and forcing him to take shelter in her house rather than risk the ride back to his ranch. Margaret prepared coffee, and they sat in her small parlor, listening to the thunder roll across the prairie and watching lightning illuminate the windows in brilliant flashes. "I should probably try to make it home," Blackwood said during a brief lull in the storm, though his tone suggested he had no real intention of leaving. "Don't be foolish," Margaret replied, surprised by her own boldness. "That lightning could strike anywhere out there. You're welcome to wait until it passes." They both knew the storm was just an excuse, a way to justify what they both wanted without having to acknowledge it directly. As the night wore on and the rain continued, the space between them on the small sofa seemed to shrink. Margaret became intensely aware of Blackwood's physical presence, the way his shoulder brushed against hers when he leaned forward to set down his coffee cup, the scent of his cologne mixing with the clean smell of rain through the open windows. When he finally kissed her, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. There was nothing rushed or desperate about the moment. It unfolded with the inevitability of sunrise, as if they'd been moving toward this point since their first meeting. Margaret responded without hesitation, surprising herself with the depth of passion that had been lying dormant since Thomas's death. "Margaret," Blackwood whispered against her ear, her name sounding different in his deep voice than it ever had before. "I've wanted this since the first day I saw you hanging laundry in your backyard." The confession sent warmth flooding through her chest. To know that this powerful, accomplished man had been thinking about her, wanting her, made her feel beautiful and desired in a way she'd almost forgotten was possible. "I've been thinking about you too," she admitted, her voice barely audible above the sound of rain on the roof. What happened next felt as natural as breathing. There was no awkwardness or uncertainty, just the sweet relief of two lonely people finding comfort and connection in each other's arms. Blackwood was gentle and patient, treating her with a tenderness that made her feel precious and protected. For the first time since Thomas's death, Margaret felt fully alive, every nerve ending awakened by touch and desire. They spent the night together in her bed, talking quietly between moments of passion, sharing stories and dreams they'd never voiced to anyone else. Blackwood told her about the loneliness of managing his vast empire without anyone to share his successes and failures with. Margaret confessed her fears about losing the farm and her uncertainty about what kind of future she could build as a single woman in their conservative community. "You don't have to face any of this alone," Blackwood assured her as dawn began to lighten the sky outside her bedroom window. "I meant what I said about wanting to help you, Margaret. I care about what happens to you." As he prepared to leave that morning, both of them understood that their relationship had crossed a line from which there was no return. They were no longer simply neighbors with a business arrangement. They were lovers bound together by shared intimacy and mutual need. The knowledge was both exhilarating and terrifying, opening up possibilities that neither had dared to consider before. Margaret watched from her porch as Blackwood rode away, his figure disappearing over the ridge toward his own ranch. She could still feel the warmth of his touch on her skin, still hear the sound of his voice whispering her name in the darkness. Whatever the consequences of what they'd shared, she couldn't bring herself to regret it. For the first time in months, she felt hope blooming in her chest like wildflowers after a spring rain. October brought cooler weather to the Texas prairie, and with it came a golden period in Margaret's relationship with James Blackwood. Their arrangement had evolved into something that defied easy categorization. Part business partnership, part romance, part secret understanding that neither fully acknowledged in daylight. Blackwood continued his evening visits under the pretense of checking on his cattle, But everyone in the county understood that his interest in Margaret Henderson's property extended far beyond livestock. The change in Margaret was noticeable to anyone who cared to look. She carried herself with a new confidence, her step lighter as she went about her daily chores. The desperate edge of worry that had haunted her since Thomas's death had softened into something more manageable. She was still a widow struggling to maintain her farm, but she was no longer struggling alone. Blackwood's financial support through the grazing arrangement had stabilized her immediate situation, and his presence in her life had filled the emotional void she'd been carrying for months. Their relationship had settled into a comfortable pattern. Blackwood would arrive each evening just as the sun began to set, ostensibly to check on his cattle, but inevitably ending up on Margaret's porch with coffee and conversation. These talks would stretch long into the night, covering everything from local politics to shared memories of their deceased spouses. The intimacy between them deepened with each passing day, built on genuine affection and mutual respect as much as physical attraction. Margaret found herself learning things about James Blackwood that surprised her. Beneath his commanding public persona, he was thoughtful and sometimes uncertain, carrying the weight of expectations that came with his wealth and influence. He spoke candidly about the pressure to maintain his ranch's success, the loneliness of making important decisions without a partner to share the burden, and his growing desire to build something meaningful beyond just accumulating more land and cattle. Sometimes, I wonder what the point of all this empire building really is, he confessed during one of their late-night conversations. I've spent 20 years building the largest ranch in 3 counties, but for what? When I'm gone, who will care that James Blackwood once owned all this land? Margaret understood the existential weight behind his words. Success without someone to share it with felt hollow, no matter how impressive it might appear to outsiders. Maybe the point isn't the empire itself, she suggested gently. Maybe it's what you do with the power and resources you've built, how you use them to help others. Her insight pleased him, and Margaret could see that her opinion mattered to him in ways that went beyond mere affection. He valued her perspective and often asked for her thoughts on ranch business and community matters. The respect was mutual. Margaret had come to rely on Blackwood's judgment and experience as she navigated the challenges of running her own property. Their physical relationship had also deepened during these autumn weeks. What had begun as a single night of passion during a thunderstorm had evolved into regular intimacy that felt both natural and necessary. Blackwood would often stay until dawn, and Margaret had grown accustomed to waking up in his arms, feeling safe and cherished in a way she'd missed desperately since Thomas's death. But it was during the 3rd week of October that Margaret first noticed the signs that would change everything. She woke one morning feeling queasy and disoriented, rushing outside to be sick behind the barn. At first, she attributed it to something she'd eaten, but when the morning sickness continued for several days, a different possibility began to take shape in her mind. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. She was pregnant with James Blackwood's child. Margaret sat on her front porch steps trying to process the magnitude of what this meant for both of them. In their community, an unmarried woman carrying a child faced social ostracism and economic ruin. Even a widow having an affair was scandalous enough. A pregnant widow would be completely shunned by respectable society. The implications for Blackwood were equally serious. As one of the county's most prominent citizens, his reputation was crucial to his business and political influence. Being known as the man who had gotten a widow pregnant out of wedlock could damage his standing in ways that might take years to repair. Margaret knew that some men in his position would simply deny responsibility and leave her to face the consequences alone. Margaret spent several sleepless nights wrestling with how to tell him. Part of her hoped that he would propose marriage immediately, solving both their problems and legitimizing their relationship. But another part feared that the news would destroy what they'd built together, forcing him to choose between his reputation and their love. When she finally gathered the courage to tell him, it was during one of their usual evening visits. Blackwood had arrived in an unusually good mood, sharing news about a successful cattle sale that would bring significant profits to his ranch. Margaret listened to his excitement, memorizing the sound of his laughter and the way his eyes lit up when he spoke about their future business plans. She wondered if this would be the last time she'd see him so relaxed and happy in her presence. "James," she said when a natural pause came in their conversation, "I have something important to tell you." Something in her tone made him look at her more carefully. his businessman's instincts picking up on the seriousness beneath her words. "What is it, Margaret? You look worried." She took a deep breath and spoke the words that would irrevocably change both their lives. "I'm going to have a baby. Your baby." The silence that followed seemed to stretch forever. Margaret watched Blackwood's face, trying to read his reaction in the flickering light of the oil lamp. His expression went through several changes: surprise, calculation, concern, and something else she couldn't quite identify. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully controlled. "Are you certain?" "As certain as I can be without seeing a doctor," Margaret replied. "All the signs are there." "I'm about 6 weeks along, I think." Blackwood stood up and walked to the edge of the porch, staring out at the dark prairie as if looking for answers in the vast emptiness. Margaret's heart sank as she watched him process the news. This wasn't the reaction of a man preparing to propose marriage and embrace fatherhood. This was the reaction of a man calculating the potential damage to his carefully constructed life. "This complicates things considerably," he said finally, his tone shifting into the same businesslike register he used when discussing cattle prices or land deals. The change in his voice sent a chill through Margaret. In the space of a few minutes, she'd gone from being his beloved companion to being a problem that needed to be managed. "I know it's not what we planned," she said quietly, "but maybe it's not such a terrible thing. We care about each other, James. Maybe this is just pushing us toward something we both want anyway." Blackwood turned back to face her, and Margaret could see the internal struggle playing out in his expression. "Margaret, you have to understand my position. I have responsibilities, obligations to the community and to my business interests. This situation requires careful handling." The word "situation" hit Margaret like a slap. Her pregnancy, their child, had been reduced to a business problem in his mind. She realized with growing horror that James Blackwood was not going to marry her, was not going to claim their child, was not going to do any of the things she'd hoped for in her most optimistic moments. The conversation that followed Margaret's announcement changed everything between them. James Blackwood, the man who had whispered endearments in her ear and held her through the night, transformed before her eyes into a calculating businessman, concerned primarily with protecting his interests. He paced the length of her small porch, his mind clearly working through the implications and potential solutions to what he now viewed as a serious problem. "We need to think this through carefully," Blackwood said, his voice taking on the authoritative tone he used when giving orders to his ranch hands. "There are ways to handle situations like this discreetly. I know a doctor in San Antonio who can help women in your condition. He's reliable and asks no questions." Margaret felt the blood drain from her face as she understood what he was suggesting. "You want me to end the pregnancy?" "I want us to consider all our options," Blackwood replied, though his tone made it clear which option he preferred. "Margaret, you have to be realistic about this. An unmarried woman with a child in this community faces complete social ruin. I'm trying to protect you from that. By suggesting I kill our baby." Margaret's voice rose with anger and disbelief. "James, this is your child we're talking about. Doesn't that mean anything to you?" Blackwood stopped pacing and looked at her with what might have been regret, but his resolve remained firm. "Of course it means something to me, but we have to think about the practical realities. I can't marry you, Margaret. My position in this community, my business relationships, everything I've built depends on maintaining a certain reputation. Being known as the man who got a widow pregnant out of wedlock would destroy me socially and financially." The brutally honest admission cut through Margaret like a knife. Everything they'd shared, the tender conversations, the passionate nights, the promises of caring and support, had been real to her, but apparently expendable to him when his reputation was at stake. "So you're willing to abandon me and our child to protect your standing with the local cattle buyers and bank presidents?" "I'm not abandoning you," Blackwood protested, though his words sounded hollow even to his own ears. "I'll make sure you're financially taken care of. We can arrange for you to visit the doctor in San Antonio. And afterward, if you want to start fresh somewhere else, I'll provide enough money for you to establish yourself comfortably in another state." Margaret stared at him in shock. He was offering to pay for her to disappear, to erase the inconvenient evidence of their relationship and pretend it had never happened. The man she'd fallen in love with was revealing himself to be capable of a coldness she'd never imagined. "And if I refuse?" she asked, her voice steady despite the turmoil in her heart. "What if I decide to keep this baby and raise it here?" Blackwood's expression hardened. Then you'd be making a very difficult choice for both of us. This community doesn't forgive moral transgressions, especially not from women. You'd be shunned by every respectable family in the county. Your child would grow up with the stigma of illegitimacy. Is that really what you want? The threat was subtle but unmistakable. If Margaret chose to keep the baby and stay in the county, she would face not just social ostracism, but likely active hostility from James Blackwood himself. His influence was so extensive that he could probably ensure she'd be unable to sell her cattle, get credit at the general store, or find help during emergencies. He was offering her a choice between cooperation and destruction. Margaret felt a strength she didn't know she possessed rising up from somewhere deep inside her. I won't get rid of this baby. James, I can't and I won't. If you don't want to be part of our child's life, that's your choice, but I won't let you pressure me into ending this pregnancy. Then you're making a mistake that will ruin both our lives, Blackwood said coldly. He picked up his hat from the porch railing and placed it firmly on his head. I'll give you a few days to reconsider. Think about what I've said, Margaret. Think about what kind of future you're choosing for yourself and for an innocent child. As he mounted his horse and rode away into the darkness, Margaret realized that the man she'd fallen in love with had been an illusion. The real James Blackwood was someone who would seduce a lonely widow for his own pleasure, but abandon her the moment their relationship became inconvenient. All his talk of caring for her, of building something meaningful together, had been lies designed to get what he wanted. The following days were the darkest of Margaret's life. She moved through her daily routine like a ghost, feeding her chickens and tending to her cattle while her mind reeled with the implications of her situation. Blackwood's cattle remained in her pasture, but he didn't come to check on them. Instead, he sent one of his ranch hands with her weekly payment and instructions to report on the livestock's condition. Margaret understood the message clearly. Their personal relationship was over, but the business arrangement would continue as long as she kept quiet about what had happened between them. The money was both a lifeline and a form of hush money, ensuring her silence while providing just enough financial support to keep her from complete destitution. Word of their broken relationship began to spread through the county's gossip networks with surprising speed. People noticed that James Blackwood no longer made his evening visits to the Henderson farm. Some speculated that he'd grown tired of the widow's company. Others suggested that Margaret had been too forward in pursuing a man above her station. None of the gossip suspected the real reason for the separation, but Margaret knew it was only a matter of time before her pregnancy became visible, and the speculation grew more vicious. She began to understand the full extent of her isolation. The other women in the community had always been polite but distant, viewing her with the mixture of pity and suspicion that widows often faced. Now, with rumors swirling about her relationship with Blackwood, even that grudging acceptance was disappearing. When she went to town for supplies, conversations stopped when she entered rooms, and eyes followed her with expressions ranging from curiosity to barely concealed disapproval. Margaret realized that James Blackwood had been right about one thing. Their community would not forgive her moral transgression. She was facing a future as a social outcast, struggling to raise a child alone while surrounded by people who viewed her as a fallen woman. The weight of that reality was almost crushing, but it also clarified her choices in a way that gave her strength. She could accept Blackwood's offer to disappear quietly, taking his money and starting over somewhere else where no one knew her story. She could try to find a husband quickly, hoping someone would marry a pregnant widow and claim the child as his own. Or she could stay and fight, determined to raise her child with dignity despite the social consequences. The decision crystallized one evening as Margaret stood in her kitchen, preparing a simple supper while Blackwood's cattle grazed peacefully in her pasture. She placed her hand on her still flat stomach and felt a fierce protectiveness surge through her. This child was innocent of the circumstances surrounding its conception. It deserved to be born and loved, regardless of what the community thought about its parents' relationship. Margaret had lost one dream when Thomas died, but she wouldn't sacrifice another to protect James Blackwood's reputation. If he was too cowardly to claim responsibility for his actions, then she would face the consequences alone. She'd survived widowhood and near bankruptcy. She could survive being an unmarried mother in a judgmental community. That night, Margaret sat down at her kitchen table and wrote 2 letters. The first was to her cousin Emma in Colorado, a woman she hadn't seen in years but who had always been kind and understanding. She explained her situation honestly and asked if there might be opportunities for a woman with farming experience in Emma's growing town. It was a backup plan, a way to ensure her child would have options even if staying in Texas became impossible. The second letter was more difficult to write. It was addressed to James Blackwood, delivered the next morning by one of his own ranch hands. In carefully chosen words, Margaret informed him that she had made her decision to keep the baby and that she expected nothing from him except to be left alone to raise their child in peace. She made it clear that she would not cause him public embarrassment by naming him as the father, but neither would she accept his money to disappear or end her pregnancy. The response came 3 days later, not in the form of a letter, but as a visit from Blackwood's foreman with instructions to remove all the cattle from Margaret's property immediately. The grazing arrangement that had provided her financial stability was terminated without explanation or compensation for the remaining weeks they'd agreed upon. Margaret watched from her porch as the cattle were driven away, understanding that this was James Blackwood's answer to her refusal to cooperate with his wishes. Without the income from the grazing fees, Margaret's financial situation became desperate again almost immediately. The brief period of stability was over, replaced by the familiar anxiety of wondering how she'd make her next mortgage payment. But instead of the crushing despair she'd felt before, Margaret discovered a grim determination. She'd been abandoned by the father of her child and cut off from his financial support, but she wasn't helpless. Margaret began making plans with the same methodical approach Thomas had taught her for managing the farm. She calculated how much money she could raise by selling some of her cattle and equipment. She researched the costs of traveling to Colorado if that became necessary. She even swallowed her pride and inquired discreetly about taking in laundry or sewing to earn extra income. The hardest part was dealing with the growing awareness in the community that something scandalous had occurred between her and James Blackwood. People who had once been merely distant became openly hostile. The general store owner's wife made pointed comments about women who forgot their place. The preacher delivered sermons about moral purity that seemed aimed directly at Margaret's pew. Children were warned away from her property, as if her supposed sin might be contagious. Through it all, Margaret held her head high and refused to show shame for choices she didn't regret. She'd loved James Blackwood genuinely, and their child was the product of that love even if he'd proven unworthy of it. She would not apologize for following her heart, even though it had led her into this difficult situation. As November approached and her pregnancy progressed, Margaret made peace with the likelihood that she would have to leave Texas before the baby was born. The letter from her cousin Emma had been encouraging, offering both a place to stay and potential work opportunities in a community that wouldn't know her history. Starting over somewhere else seemed like the wisest choice for both her and her child's future, but Margaret underestimated the lengths to which some people would go to punish what they saw as moral transgression. The worst was yet to come, and it would arrive in a form that would test every ounce of strength and determination she possessed. December brought the worst winter storm in memory to the Texas prairie, but the weather was the least of Margaret's problems. By now, her pregnancy was becoming visible despite her efforts to conceal it with loose-fitting dresses and shawls. The whispers that had followed her through town for weeks grew louder and more vicious as people began to piece together the timeline of her relationship with James Blackwood and the obvious conclusion it led to. The breaking point came on a bitter cold morning when Margaret discovered that someone had painted the word whore across the side of her barn in large red letters. She stood in the snow, staring at the cruel message, feeling the weight of her community's judgment like a physical blow. This wasn't just gossip anymore. This was active persecution designed to drive her away in shame. Margaret's first instinct was to grab a bucket of paint and cover the hateful word immediately. But something made her stop. Instead, she went back into her house and wrote a letter to the county sheriff, documenting the vandalism and requesting an investigation. If her neighbors wanted to treat her like a criminal, she would demand the legal protections that even criminals deserved. Sheriff Tom Bradley arrived that afternoon, a weathered man in his 50s who had known Margaret and Thomas for years. He examined the painted message with obvious discomfort, clearly wishing he was anywhere else. "Mrs. Henderson, I'm sorry this happened to your property. Vandalism is a crime, regardless of what some folks might think about other matters. Do you have any idea who might have done this?" Margaret asked, though she suspected the sheriff's investigation would be perfunctory at best. Bradley removed his hat and scratched his gray hair, a gesture that suggested his discomfort with the entire situation. I'll ask around, but I have to be honest with you. People are talking. Mrs. Henderson, there's a lot of anger in town about your situation. Some folks think you've brought shame on the whole community. Margaret felt her temper flare. My situation? You mean the fact that I'm an unmarried woman carrying a child? Have any of these angry people considered holding the father equally responsible for this supposed shame? The sheriff's expression grew even more uncomfortable. Mrs. Henderson, I can't get involved in speculation about who might or might not be the father of your child. My job is to investigate this vandalism, nothing more. But Margaret could see in his eyes that he knew exactly who the father was. Everyone in the county had watched James Blackwood's regular visits to her farm. The timeline was obvious to anyone who cared to calculate it. The difference was that Blackwood was a powerful man whose reputation the community was willing to protect, while she was expendable. I see, Margaret said coldly. So you'll investigate the painting on my barn, but you won't ask any uncomfortable questions about why I'm being targeted for something that requires two people to accomplish. Sheriff Bradley replaced his hat and backed toward his horse. I'll do what I can about the vandalism, Mrs. Henderson. But if I were you, I'd think seriously about whether this is the right place to raise a child. Sometimes a fresh start somewhere else is the best solution for everyone involved. After he left, Margaret realized that even the law wasn't going to protect her. The sheriff's suggestion that she leave town was as clear as an order. Stay and face escalating persecution, or disappear quietly and let the community pretend the scandal had never happened. That evening, Margaret made a decision that surprised even herself. Instead of hiding in her house or beginning preparations to leave town, she hitched up her wagon and drove to the center of town. She tied her horse to the post in front of the general store and walked inside. Her head held high despite the obvious bulge of her pregnancy. The store fell silent as she entered. Mrs. Patterson, the store owner's wife, stared at her with unconcealed disapproval. Two other women who had been examining bolts of fabric moved away from her as if she carried a contagious disease. Margaret ignored their reactions and walked to the counter where Mr. Patterson stood looking extremely uncomfortable. I need supplies, Margaret said simply, placing her shopping list on the counter. Flour, coffee, lamp oil, and fabric for baby clothes. The emphasis on the last item sent a visible shock through the store. Margaret was not just refusing to hide her pregnancy, she was openly preparing for the birth of her child. Mr. Patterson glanced around nervously before gathering the items on her list, clearly wishing the other customers would leave so he wouldn't have to conduct this transaction in front of witnesses. That'll be $4.60, he said quietly, avoiding eye contact. Margaret counted out the money slowly, making sure everyone in the store could see that she was paying her bills honestly, despite the whispered assumptions about her moral character. Thank you, Mr. Patterson. Please tell your wife that I hope her rheumatism is feeling better. The polite pleasantry, delivered as if nothing unusual was happening, seemed to disconcert the other women more than any angry confrontation would have. Margaret was refusing to play the role of the ashamed fallen woman that they expected. Instead, she was conducting herself with the same dignity she'd always shown, forcing them to confront the ugliness of their own behavior. As Margaret loaded her supplies into the wagon, she heard Mrs. Patterson's voice carrying clearly from inside the store. The nerve of that woman, flaunting herself in public in her condition. Someone should speak to Mr. Blackwood about what his charity has led to. The comment confirmed what Margaret had suspected. People knew James Blackwood was the father of her child, but they were blaming her alone for the supposed moral failing. In their minds, she had seduced and corrupted a respected man, rather than acknowledging that he had pursued and abandoned her when the consequences became inconvenient. The ride home through the December cold gave Margaret time to think. She could continue this public battle for respect and dignity, or she could accept the reality that her community would never forgive her for threatening their comfortable assumptions about powerful men and powerless women. The baby growing inside her deserved better than a lifetime of whispered accusations and social ostracism. That night, Margaret wrote another letter to her cousin Emma in Colorado, this time accepting the offer of refuge and a fresh start. She would leave Texas after the baby was born, when travel would be safer and she'd be strong enough for the journey. Until then, She would endure whatever persecution her neighbors chose to inflict, secure in the knowledge that she had nothing to be ashamed of. The final month of her pregnancy brought unexpected support from an unlikely source. Dr. Harrison, the elderly physician who had cared for Thomas during his final illness, appeared at her door one snowy evening with his medical bag and a determined expression. "Mrs. Henderson, I hear you're in need of medical care," he said simply. "I've been a doctor for 30 years, and I've never yet turned away a woman who needed help bringing a child into the world." Margaret invited him in gratefully, surprised to find an ally when she'd expected only enemies. Dr. Harrison examined her thoroughly and pronounced both mother and baby healthy. As he prepared to leave, he paused at her door. "Mrs. Henderson, I want you to know that not everyone in this community approves of how you've been treated. Some of us remember that it takes two people to create a child, and we're disgusted by the cowardice of men who would let a woman face the consequences alone." The validation meant more to Margaret than she could express. As her due date approached, she felt a complex mixture of anticipation and sorrow. Soon she would hold her child in her arms, but she would also be leaving the only home she'd ever known. James Blackwood's refusal to claim responsibility for their child had cost her everything: her reputation, her community, and her future in Texas. But as Margaret felt her baby moving inside her, she realized that some things were worth any sacrifice. This child would be loved and wanted, even if its father was too much of a coward to acknowledge its existence. She would build a new life in Colorado, far from the judgment and hypocrisy of people who valued reputation more than truth. And someday, perhaps, James Blackwood would realize what he had lost when he chose his standing in the community over love and responsibility.